Awesome, thanks for your help.
You're welcome. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's great. All right, everyone, welcome to new queer and trans methods. In order to kind of minimize transition time and maximize what our speakers are going to be presenting on, I'm just going to give everyone's brief bio now. What I am going to share does not do justice to all the amazing work they do, so I encourage you to go and check out the program to read the full bios of all of our participants. My name is Muriel Zaborskis. I'm an associate professor of American Studies and Gender Studies at Penn State Harrisburg, and it is an honor to be here today. And so our first co-presenters will be Meg Fowler, who is a transformative change scholar, contemplative practitioner, and cultural strategist whose interdisciplinary work inhabits the generative edge of ecofeminism, queer imaginaries, and transformative theories of change. Meg is co-presenting with Rory Crath, who's an interdisciplinary researcher. Oh, sorry, Rory. Corey and Rory, that's and we go way back to like 10 minutes ago, so I really should know this. But Rory is an interdisciplinary researcher and associate professor at Smith College School for Social Work, who explores such themes as risk governance, the material aesthetics of biopolitics and its discontents, and queer embodiments. This presentation will be followed by one by Sam Wood, who is a fourth-year PhD candidate in English language and literature at the University of Michigan. Sam studies 20th century multi-ethnic and queer literatures of the United States, critical ethnic studies, queer of color critique, theories of relationality, and histories of race, gender, and sexuality. Next, we'll have Warren Taijeron, who is a Filipino queer writer, digital illustrator, organizer, and scholar who holds a master's in Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and came from there. So like quite we not going to present on her trip, but we all had so many questions. And has a focus on Khmer epistemologies of care in relation to decolonial futures and queerness. And finally, we will have Clawson, who is an administrative professional who adores supporting the research, teaching, and service missions of higher education, and is coming to us from Rutgers, New York. So I am thrilled to turn things over to our first panelists, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm Megan Fowler.
And Rory Crown.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. We're gonna set my timer so we get to our time. We're gonna start our panel here, our conversation in kind of an ecological direction. So this clicker works, which it was a second one. Oh. I think the Zoom, oh, there we go. Okay. So to begin, this discussion dwells in and with the disquiet of living amidst planetary collapse, or what is increasingly referred to as planetary polycrisis, a term that denotes, quoting Albert, a set of inextricable, entangled, systemic crises that are nonetheless irreducible to each other, and that cannot be reduced to a single system, even if we agree that global capitalism is the ecologically dominant driver. So these are crises that affect all living matter, a growing precarity that is lived and felt, albeit differentially, and that spans socio-political, economic, and ecological systems, including, of course, the resurgence of authoritarianism and its perils for democracy, society, and planet. Yet modes of thought are tenacious, and the kinds of thinking that have contributed to these escalating conditions are unlikely to provide the solution we require. But crises, of course, also represent a turning point in the life of a system, a critical opportunity that we engage as a problematic of how to reimagine queer class configurations, specifically in relation to our escalating ecological crises. So framed by these insights, our discussion tracks the significance of reconfiguring dominant modes of thinking, which affect our ability to both problematize and story futures otherwise. We illustrate this by considering the analytic and agentic implications across the designations of Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and the provocative Cthulhucene. The widely distributed Anthropocene frames polycrisis as an issue of human dominance, where the biosphere has been fundamentally transformed by human activity. By contrast, the Capitalocene draws our attention to capitalism's global supremacy as it entangles with colonialist logics and hierarchical differentiations of human and non-human life worlds. In the words of Moore, capitalism is a world ecology of power, capital, and nature. Yet we ground our thinking in the latter within Donna Haraway's provocative, speculative Cthulhucene, a narrative framing that lingers with key elements of Moore's thesis, but draws us further, gesturing towards, in her language, a tentacular, unfinished time of earthly entanglements, composed of human and more than human solidarities. As she writes, a kind of time place for learning to stay with the trouble of living responsibly on a wounded earth. So Haraway's Cthulhucene frames what's at stake in this conversation, and of course for life on this planet in this historical time, and alludes to the imaginative and creative nature of this work that's invested in how we can reimagine our methodological tools and knowledge practices in ways that help us restore and restory the human-earth relationship. As Haraway famously incites, make kin, not babies, further elucidating the dominant Western imaginary as one transfixed by human supremacist and indeed cis-heteronormative, pro-natalistic renderings of class, kinship, and relationality, much of which we trouble in this talk. So from these bases, two lines of inquiry orient this exploration. The first, what does it mean to reconfigure queer class solidarities in the face of climate change, environmental degradation, and biodiversity loss, which disproportionately affects the health and viability of communities already experiencing socioeconomic marginalization and displacement? And then secondly, how might a more than human reading of queerness not only contest exploitative relations of class and capital, but also reorient practices of resistance and world making?
What ethical maps do such times require? And what ideas, practices, tools, and techniques might we experiment with, lean into, even gamble on in a research and scholarship to help reimagine Earth-human kinships and chart radically inclusive queer futurities? Living in Inquiry 1, how might the I and me called to be responsible in these times locate queer joy in the struggle of developing post-anthropocentric practices, ethics, and imaginaries as vital forms of resistance and re-existence?
So when we kind of center the critique here, and starting with Marxist thought, particularly framing Black, queer, and feminist. Whoop. We got a tech person? Tech.
I don't know what happened either though. Just can you click on was there something with the remote maybe?
Did I try to lower the zoom like that? To minimize this? It won't even open.
It seems like it seems like it's
over.
oh, yes, I think I think there's a projector remote. I mean, is over here. This is the HDMI for correct?
Oh,
I wonder if we just unplug it and replug it back in. That would
try the old.
yeah. Hey, well,
Technology. We are in the 21st century, people.
Projector is not connecting.
Are we able to get the 10% again?
I'm not sure what we should try to do.
Well, this is the team for
Here, let me go.
Should we go back
Here,
to
okay,
low?
okay, wait.
What is that? That's it. Should we go?
No, it's just trying to cycle through to find something that will.
Naturally, right?
Yeah.
Naturally.
Thank you all for your patience. It should be that one.
Oh, that's it, that. Spoke to the left.
Most of them.
Yeah,
I think we'll-
I'm wondering if we should just.
I thought maybe kind of proceed and, we'll
Keep going.
I know it's not.
Yeah,
But I'll.
I don't know whether there's an opportunity to share slides at some.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll figure.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah,
We just.
I think we'll respect the time, keep going,
Yeah.
jump over the hiccup, okay. Let's retrace, thank you. So first focusing on Marxist thought for a moment, particularly Black, queer, and feminist lineages of theorizing, there's been a powerful production of analytic frames and imaginal registers for speculating on modes of world and otherwise that might emerge in the wake of racialized capitalistic ruination, cementing more critical and intersectional understandings of class, exploitation, estrangement, and of course, solidarities. But we note, however, the creeping humanistic logics that continue to be operative in many of this work and these writings, further solidifying the boundaries around how we understand class relations, opening while foreclosing certain pathways for how we live and understand and intervene in the world, including around who or what is afforded our ethical attention and care. Moore's thesis on capitalism as a world ecology extends Marxist formulations in key ways, including by establishing the natural world or more than human world as central rather than supplemental to class relations. As an inherently, I'll just keep going. We'll just keep going. As an inherently violent and exploitative structure, particularly for minoritarian life worlds, capitalism, of course, organizes the more than human world and our relationship to it at levels material, psychic, affective, and ethical. But less visible is that capitalism works because, as Moore puts it, human violence is part of a larger repertoire of strategies that put nature to work. Hey.
Hey, Wizard, thank you so much. Why that happened?
No, that's
Oh, that's really great.
Let's see it.
Wow.
Although
It's frozen.
it's frozen.
No.
Oh, no.
Okay.
All right.
It's, oh my God.
Thanks
Okay.
for hanging with us. With
Yeah.
these hiccups. So, yeah, it is the invisibility of this architecture that capitalism hinges upon, predicated on dualistic divisions that structure our imaginal and material worlds, dividing human from more than human, culture from nature, social from ecological, wherein the more than human is categorically othered, commodified, and thus rendered expendable and disposable. While Moore's thesis highlights the role of these imaginal regimes that tear apart the relational fabric of our world, it stopped short of proposing the practical enactments required to undo these deeply habituated modes of thinking, perceiving, and imagining. I didn't touch that. Wow, we'll keep going.
Okay,
What
keep
about-
over.
yeah. So
The hints of the
it's
vision.
right here that we want to highlight. It's eco-queer and eco-feminist scholarship, decolonial writers and thinkers, indigenous scholarship that starts to offer a really crucial missing component. From these vantages, the violences of capitalism and its inherent entanglements with other logics of supremacy, colonialist supremacy, white supremacy, male supremacy, human supremacy, and the list could go on, right? Hinge at a meta level on dualisms that separate, that categorize, and hierarchize through exclusionary binaries. As these theorists argue, the work of cultivating anthropocentric epistemologies, ontologies, and imaginaries are epochal imperatives, and they are inseparable from post-gender pursuits, from queer liberation, from decolonial gestures and racial justice, indigenous sovereignty, and women's rights, and the list goes on. So importantly, from these theoretical vantages, there's also an implication on our knowledge practices, calling for more intentional ways of participating in worlding queer class configurations toward radically inclusive post-anthropocentric worlds.
What other stories can our research tell? And what other worlds can it help us remember when we disorient from these essentialized underpinnings and engage in the capacious and deeply relational project of queering and ecologizing research? Living inquiry 2. How might the I and we call to be responsive to worlds otherwise? Open queer scholarly pathways for thinking with, sensing with, and becoming with the more than human world as vital, ethical responses to these times of escalating precarity.
Just catching up. Okay. So as a methodological intervention that is at once onto-epistemic and ethico-political in nature, EqPAR invites a post-anthropocentric turn in our ethics, our knowledge practices, and ways of participating in world building through our research and scholarship. So this is really an experimentation at the crossroads of new materialisms, drawing heavily from the work of Karen Barad, participatory action research paradigms, and post-anthropocentric thought centered in Haraway's scholarship. And it takes seriously that methodology must be responsive and responsible to the socio-material conditions of the historical present, a view conciliant with Barad's admonition that knowing is a material practice of engagement as part of the world in its differential becoming. Thus, EqPAR recognizes that knowledge production is not simply about making facts, but about making worlds, as Barad writes, wherein a researcher's practices of knowledge are actively reconfiguring the world they seek to investigate. In this framing, methods are not neutral procedures, but worlding apparatuses, vital for unsettling the calcified boundaries, temporal, spatial, ethical, affective, that foreclose more than human kinships and futurities. These understandings reposition inquiry as not only a method of investigating the world.
I would say since we have the disruption.
Okay, keep moving.
Proceed, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, appreciate it. But as a process of becoming with the more than human world that lives and moves and breathes through the routine performances and repetitions of our knowledge practices. So very briefly, we'd like to just offer a quick sketch of a couple tools that we recognize as part of this work. So the first tool, sensory ethnography, draws heavily on the work of Sarah Pink, inviting researchers to move towards practices that account for the emplaced multisensorial dimensions of researchers' participants' emerging life worlds. Attended to are the roles that sensorial perceptions and embodiments play in meaning making and in the formation of human more than human assemblages. The storying that sensory ethnography elicits emerges through shared participation in the atmospheres, textures, sounds, scents, and rhythms that comprise everyday life. Embodied interviewing queers and ecologizes the conventional interview's performativity, reconfiguring its epistemic and ontological center of gravity. Like sensory ethnography, embodied interviewing does not privilege narrative content alone, but attends to how meaning unfolds in a more somatic, sensorial, and affective way within what is presupposed to be the shifting relational fields of the interviewing space and process. So emphasis is placed on the more implicit, more than verbal resonances that can be sensed, contacted, symbolized, and gradually differentiated through careful somatic attention by both interviewer and interviewee. And the final tool, ecosomatic body mapping, extends participatory body mapping traditions by reworking the boundaries of the body as inherently permeable and multiple, co-constituted, and relationally configured rather than as a discrete bounded object. In EqPAR, ecosomatic body mapping ecologizes embodiment. Participants can map not only interior conditions and affective responses, but attachments, injuries, longings, kinships, and ethical tensions as they are lived in relation to land, waterways, climate, species, environmental toxins, built infrastructures, and both ancestral or imagined ecologies, rendering visible the human and more than human choreographies through which subjectivity and meaning take shape. So collectively, these agentic tools offer a reorientation attentive to how human and more than human relations conspire in the production of meaning and worlding, opening inquiry to the tacit, bodily, material, and aesthetic exchanges that constitute ever-becoming life worlds, while introducing simultaneously opportunities to cultivate expansive and expressive sense-making channels that can break apart sedimented patterns of perception and help move us towards multi-species entanglements. So to kind of stitch some of these thoughts together, from Anthropocene and Capitalocene to Haraway's provocative Chthulucene, how we frame and narrate these times holds grave consequence. Echoing Haraway, we can no longer afford not to think the world as it is actually being lived, nor to avoid confronting the worlding that we are contributing to in our scholarship. Provoked by the Chthulucene, we are compelled to relearn how to make kin across ossified boundaries and normative categories of care, reweaving, as she writes, lines of inventive connection that repair, restore, and restory human and more than human relations. EqPAR represents one queering formulation of how we might participating in co-creating such shifts. Worlding worlds threaded tenuously together by entangled empathies and kinships in defense of life itself. And of course, regardless of the nomenclature that we ultimately use, we must remember that ours is a time where the insight matters, the recognition matters, that imagination is not a luxury or a privilege, but a necessity.
So living inquiry 3, to those of us choosing to be responsible, responsive to these times, we are invited to ask and continue to ask what life worlds and what life ways are our knowledge practices already enacting, and what configurations might they yet be able to sense, co-create, and bring with into being. Thank you.
And thanks so much for everyone's patience in our technological crisis, but we are post-crisis and maybe now.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here. We'll get started in just a second. Brilliant. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the conference organizers and the tech team, and all of you as well for persevering. We'll get started with my presentation on how to win the strike, welding queer class relations in William Attaway's Blood on the Forge. Near the start of William Attaway's 1941 novel, Blood on the Forge, the Moss brothers, Melody, the Sissy Feller, Chinatown, and Big Black Irish Matt board a train north to pursue work in the steel mills. Escaping the wretched life of sharecropping for the promise of higher paying work in the mills, the brothers arrive in Pennsylvania's Allegheny Valley to encounter for the first time a multiracial integrated workforce. Coming from the checkered hills of the sharecropping and Jim Crow South, the Black brothers perceive work on the forge as upending the segregationist logics that had previously patterned their lives. While at first the steel mill appears as a radical site of cross-racial, class-based solidarity formation, it ultimately becomes the setting for an unsuccessful and deadly strike. Despite the steelworkers' best attempts at unifying a proletariat, The strike ultimately fails because of the union's one-dimensional class-based politics that accounts for neither the complexities of racial formation nor of queer class relations. In chronicling the Moss's experiences on the forge, Attaway's novel presents new relational modes for how to win the strike. Running parallel to the multiracial labor-based encounters that occur between steelworkers on the forge, Attaway's novel also presents cross-cultural encounters connected to another form of labor, being sex work. Blood on the Forge acknowledges how race and class are intimately linked to formations of sexuality and gender, making explicit queer class connections. As Kristen Marie Taylor and Shauna Russell have brilliantly argued about the novel, Attaway juxtaposes the class-based drama of the strike alongside larger interrogations of gender and sexuality, hinting toward a profound and multidimensional political awakening. The connections among race, gender, and sexuality are integral to the novel's later call for coalitional welding as a critique of the union's one-dimensional political project. In this way, welding emerges from Attaway's novel as a relational framework that attends to the incommensurabilities of organizing across multiple modes of difference. Attending to the perils and possibilities of relational solidarity, this paper explores how Attaway uses the language of welding to theorize alloyed alliances that refuse demands for homogeneity when forming solidarities. Welding builds bridges, trestles, and linkages across differences, like those inherent in queer class relations, without necessitating the sacrifice of particularity, history, or individual identity. On their first night in the Allegheny Valley, having been just initiated in the steel mills, the Moss brothers walk along the margins of the Monongahela River, exploring their new home. During this walk, they encounter a, quote, fat-cheeked black girl, bright red lipstick had turned purple on her lips, a man's hat was pulled down over her ears, she wore an old overall coat over a stained satin dress, end quote. The brothers are quick to identify this woman as a sex worker who is transgressive in both her profession and her dress. Soon after, they realize she is plagued by a, quote, rot stink, her left breast about rotten off, end quote. While this moment of encounter is the only time in which this unnamed woman physically appears within the novel, she haunts Melody Moss's imagination, ultimately illuminating forms of queer class relation. I have come to read this woman as an anticipatory and imperfect premonition of the, quote, black drag queen prostitute who sachets along a waterfront, end quote, who serves as the foundation of Roderick Ferguson's formulation of queer color critique in his groundbreaking 2003 monograph, Aberrations in Black. In similar ways that Ferguson's subject demonstrates the complex co-constitutions of race, gender, class, and sexuality, the ways in which, quote, her racial difference is inseparable from her sexual incongruity, her gender eccentricity, and her class marginality, end quote. Attaway's spectral black sex worker similarly highlights the intricacies of her own subject position, the gendered implication of her man's hat and overall coat, the class implications of her profession, her lipstick and her stained dress, the disability implications of her rot stink. Abject, rotting, and ultimately reviled by the Moss brothers, this black sex worker is a multiply determined subject, legible only through intersectional analyses of her interlocking identities. She cannot be understood under a one-dimensional politics and thus highlights the limitations of any politics that wishes to interpret her one-dimensionally. Melody is haunted by the provocations inspired by this unnamed sex worker's intersecting subject positions. When meeting Anna, the 14-year-old Mexican migrant sex worker whom Big Matt, Melody's brother, later takes as his girlfriend, Melody reflects how Anna has, quote, more than one woman shackled in her eyes. All the women he had seen were here. Here was the fat-cheeked black girl he had seen walking in the rain, the woman whose left breast died and rotted until she stank so no man would buy her for a dime. Here, quivering above the weeds, were the freckled legs of the, and I will use the more politically correct term, just like European, being covered by her brother. Here were the women smelling of rut and sweat and some milkweed crushed in the field ground under their raw buttocks. The blues singer in a Kentucky juke joint, lifting her skirt to cover coins on table corners. Here were the women seen through a window or behind a door, again, the sick eyes of the fat-cheeked girl walking in the rain, end quote. Approaching an encounter along multiple lines of difference, Melody is met with the fricative quandary of relation, the crisis of opacity, what Edward Glissant names as the foundational paradox of relation. In this moment, Melody sees Anna as her opaque and unknowable individual, as well as a constituent of other identities, a sex worker, a woman, a Mexican-American, a teenager. Relating to Anna by relating her to others, Melody simultaneously flattens and multiplies Anna onto and into all the other women he has known. This gender-based multiplication crosses lines of race, class, and region in its disentangling of gender identity and profession. Mexican-American Anna becomes Black at the same time as she becomes European, a blues singer and a field worker, a sexual victim, and a sexual agent. Melody sees Anna both through the transparency of a window and, importantly, the opacity of a door. He knows her, and he doesn't. These are the very complexities that emerge when thinking queer class relations, seeing similarity and possibility without sacrificing particularity. In his attention to the minutiae of his encounter with Anna, Melody exhibits an explicit interest in the processes of relation and estrangement, what Tegan Bradway has recently named queer meta-relationality. The political and ethical capacity of navigating difference toward both world-shattering and, importantly here, world-soldering potentials. In forming solidarities, we break down walls built to divide and separate us at the same time as we solder or weld new alliances. While Melody practices this queer meta-relational perspective, Anna reductively labels him as a queer, quote, sissy feller. Meanwhile, Melody's brother, Big Matt, becomes a strike-breaking deputy under the illusion of class ascendancy. Later in Blood on the Forge, amidst an otherwise bloody strike, William Attaway's novel shifts away from the Moss brothers and takes on the perspective of the union organizers in a tender moment of purposeful waiting. During this perspectival shift, as the union workers sit and wait for the arrival of what will be a murderous, strike-ending violence, these union members collectively imagine the relational possibilities of welding. As they wait in hushed yet anxious anticipation, an unnamed union organizer begins telling a story to calm the room's nerves. Quote, say, did I ever tell you folks about the time I was welding in Monessen? I was nothing but a kid. There I was doing a man's job. My own man taught all the boys the trade, you know? End quote. At what first seems like a hollow anecdote, quickly captures the undivided attention of the union members, accruing a meaning that is not immediately legible to its listeners. The room becomes engrossed in the story as they seem to collectively realize that, quote, he might have been telling them how to win the strike, end quote. The man continues his story as his comrades listen. Quote, my old lady run a boarding house, took in all the metal workers that had paid $3 a week and took in all that pudding. Wasn't always that way, but there was a fire on a trestle and my old man got himself burned some. So I had to do the welding and there had to be boarders, end quote. The rest of the story goes untold as violence takes place. What then might we make of this story and why might it be labeled as providing instruction on how to win the strike? In telling the story of his childhood experience with welding, the union organizer reveals an intricate web of expansive affiliation and relation. His father, seemingly injured by a railroad bridge fire, a fire on a trestle, is rendered unable to provide for his family financially, and the organizer's family home thus becomes a boarding house out of economic necessity. Queering the domestic space, which was once the site of filial inheritance, a boy being taught the family trade, becomes an filial site of community organizing. Refusing to become disenchanted by the fires that have afflicted the father and literally burned down the town's bridges, the organizer's family take metal workers into their home. In opening their home, the organizer's family remains steadfast in their investment in the promises of fusion despite its potential to harm. In this manner, welding becomes both a filial vocational metallurgical practice and a method of affiliative community organizing. Both forms of welding become equally necessary for the survival of the family and their community as they forge life-giving, world-soldering solidarities in the face of interpersonal harm. Lessons the union here seems to have sorely forgotten. In what appears to be an intentional opposition to the violent, purging, metallurgic practices of steel fabrication that take place within the steel mill around which the novel centers, welding emerges from within the intimate domestic space as an alternative metallurgic process of fusing two or more metals together without sacrificing the integrity of each individual part. The boarding house then acts as the site of collective cohabitation, despite of and in spite of difference. In this way, the organizer's oral remark that there had to be borders becomes doubly legible. Borders functioning here as a double entendre that references both the necessity of collective housing, as well as the maintenance of the borders between the diverse and discrete identities of those who come into contact during their stay. Welding thus maintains the integrity of each individual border. At the same time, welding forges linkages, creating here a trestle across difference, a space for contact and solidarity. To win the strike, the organizer seems to realize, one must acknowledge and embrace difference rather than demanding its erasure. In this way, the weld becomes precisely the hyphen between queer and class in the formation of queer class. Two linked yet distinct identities in and of difference. Welding these identities encourages us to look closer, to note the ways in which we are all uniquely entangled and co-constituted. By positing welding as a metaphorical relational methodology, Attaway seems to be critiquing the union's one-dimensional class consciousness. The strike concludes with no real winners. Big Black Irish Matt dies in a melee with the union organizers. While mourning the death of their brother, Melody in Chinatown Moss enact the relational welding that the novel earlier theorizes. Boarding a segregated train to Pittsburgh's Strip District, Melody in Chinatown are joined by one other Black man who, like Chinatown, has gone blind through work. After asking the Moss brothers for a light, conversation ensues and the brothers learn that this man is a soldier, haunted by the sounds of gunfire. The soldier asks Chinatown if he too can hear the boom, 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 the sound of distant guns, the sounds of war. While initially unable to hear these sounds, Chinatown strains his ears until he discovers them. For Chinatown, the soldier's booms of the Great War's gunfire become the booms of the steel mill's bessemers. Though requiring some deft and imaginative straining, forging solidarities here does not rely upon the erasure of these men's particularities. Brutalized by the debilitating effects of a system of racial capitalism that renders both their bodies expendable surplus, these two men end the novel sitting together, quote, listening for sounds that didn't exist. They were twins, end quote. With this observation, the novel concludes. Of course, these men are not literally identical, nor are they one and the same. To be a twin here does not require an identical subjectivity. By doing the imaginative work of relation, these men arrive at an understanding of their distinct but similar subject positions. They are perhaps more aptly than fraternal twins. By ending the novel on this note of affiliation, Attaway seems to invite readers to consider the other twins that he has purposefully staged as imperfect mirrors throughout his novel. For example, readers might reflect upon the intentional parallels Attaway draws between the commodification of the steel workers' bodies and the bodies of the town's sex workers, the twins here that are most clearly related in welding, queer, and class. Readers might understand the important overlaps and differences between the Mexican-American Anna and the unnamed Black sex worker, as well as the larger cast of European-American sex workers. Attaway invites his readers to think multidimensionally about the systems of power at play within his text, to think critically about the novel's more subtle twins, to weld across difference for themselves. In this way, Blood on the Forge presents an intricate relational network of bodies working within systems of class, race, gender, and sexuality. In drawing his readers' attention to the challenge of forming relations across lines of difference, Attaway proposes welding as the way to win the strike. Attaway suggests that coalition is strongest not when difference is erased or subsumed under the guise of a one-dimensional politics, but rather in welding of relations across these differences. Thank you.
I'm Gen Z, but that doesn't mean I'm good at technology. So we're gonna see what happens together. Yeah, I don't know what to do next. I don't know how to make it like a presentation.
I think it's.
Do I just have to do it like this? That's fine.
No, no, no.
But I think I can make this smaller and then that bigger. And then I could do this. Oh, it's the worst. Is that fine? Or do I? Yeah. That one?
Yeah.
There you go.
There? It's like, okay, that's fine.
Okay, the Zoom is okay. We've got a special room. We're good. Okay, you're good.
Okay, yay, okay. Hapaday, hello, everyone. Thank you to my co-panelists and everyone who came. My name is Lauren Taijeron, my pronouns are she, they. I'm a queer Chamorro Filipino from Guahan. Guahan is an island in Micronesia, so the total other side of the Pacific, Hawaii. And Chamorros are the indigenous people of Guahan and the Northern Mariana Islands above it. And so today I'm presenting my master's thesis, practicing expansive definitions of Guinaiya. Guinaiya means love. We'll get into that more later. Some context for the audience: Guam is an unincorporated U.S. territory. We cannot vote for president and have a non-voting representative in Congress. We have experienced 3 colonial powers, first colonized in the 1600s by Spain, and then were handed over to the U.S. in 1989, then occupied by Japan from 1941 until the U.S. seized Guam back from Japan in 1944. And so capitalizing on such a devastating occupation by another military power, marked by a near wipeout of the Chamorro population on Guam, each year a parade is held on a day known as Liberation Day, referring to the day Chamorros were liberated from the Japanese by the U.S. In 2025, new details of the parade were shared with the community with a news article titled 81st Liberation Queen Can Be Older, Mom and Married, plus must be born female. I watched as LGBTQ advocates, community members, and friends discuss the transphobia. And I found myself uneasy seeing a dream for inclusion into Liberation Day. And so I opened the thesis with this story and another that speaks to the act of tending to the land in hopes that we might seek something more than inclusion. Drawing from homomilitarism, an article published in 2015, Keith Camacho demonstrates how homomilitarism functions as a new gendered formation of power, wherein the intertwined discourse of gay marriage, gay tourism, and U.S. militarism cohere to guarantee life for some members of the nation in the aftermath of 9/11. Specifically, Camacho is discussing this argument in reference to Guam and Hawaii, and its relevance to these stories is that we, as queer and or trans Chamorro, must identify what we truly need and want from any claims towards liberation, and identify the factors that inhibit or distract us from reaching it. I have 3 research questions that I answer in both the academic paper, known as the thesis, but additionally through the zine, which features photos, artwork, and stories from 8 queer Chamorro. I'll give a link for it later. And the questions are: how do we as Chamorro define, understand, and practice Guinaiya completely in love? I'll give those definitions later as well. And how do queer Chamorro handle harm within the community versus violence enacted by colonial settler powers? And what does it mean to be a queer Chamorro within the decolonization movement? So to summarize quickly, this section, queer and trans Chamorro are very interested in projects and research about themselves. And I had a really overwhelming response within a 3-day period when I had shared that I wanted to do this research. I also received community support from demilitarization, decolonization, and LGBTQ organizational leaders within the community. One of the methods I did was, I called it collaborative community research. From community zines to podcasts to oral history, much of my initial proposal was built on fragments of queer and trans Chamorro stories, accompanied by other Black, Indigenous, Pacifica, and queer scholars' work. And while this is a symptom of a still growing body of Chamorro research, it is also an opportunity to set a standard for how queer Chamorro research can be conducted. We're supposed to be here. It's okay. And part of this collaborative effort is also the idea of reflexivity within research. Receiving consent and maintaining communication with contributors allows for me to not be some overarching authority, maintaining belonging and accountability to my own community. Creating the zine and documenting stories also allowed me to contribute something with and to my community. Yay! Okay, Anafa Malik is the framework utilized to shape this research and the choices made throughout its development. Anafa Malik is the Chamorro concept of restoring harmony or order, which when broken down can translate to mean to make good. It has unfortunately been equated or reduced to mean to get along and has been weaponized to silence or limit efforts of protest. Dr. Michael Babakwa explores some of these limitations and how when used in this way, it can prohibit agency, precluding change, preventing things from adapting or changing because of a sense of needing to work together, or suppress particular voices or ideas in the name of maintaining a sense of harmony. And I appreciate these criticisms and analysis and find that the appropriate response is that we share and create new stories that give meaning to our words, reclaiming them and the agency we give them. I recognize protest and disruption to be vital parts of getting to a place of harmony and making things good. My contributors and I are attempting to bring us to a place of harmony by utilizing our stories to rebuild, retell, and write our histories, recognizing how they have been violently erased throughout several and continuing colonial occupations. Okay. In this section, I also discussed Inagofli'i and Expansive Guinaiya. Inagofli'i, while colloquially used to mean to care for someone, translates to truly seeing one another as a form of care. I believe that to truly commit to seeing someone, we must investigate the various systems and forces that are impacting them. As queer men's motor, we are historically made invisible and communally suppressed. So to be truly seen requires affirmation that you're committed to uncovering and dismantling the forces that impose themselves upon us. Finally, I utilize and term expansive Guinaiya to place focus and emphasis on love and care and its need to be expansive, as well as the forms of Guinaiya that have been policed, suppressed, or erased. Expansive Guinaiya can look like queer and transgender existence, fierce commitments to land and community in the form of protest, or solidarity with Black and Indigenous peoples all around the world. Similar to having to label myself as queer, Guinaiya, while it might have always been expansive, needs emphasis for the way that our love has been influenced by cultural forces. I also spend some time speaking to the term queer and what does it mean to queer Chamorro, other Pacifica, other Indigenous peoples, and what can the terms that come from within our own communities embody that maybe queer can't, and vice versa. Initially, when I first began this research, I was deeply interested in how Chamorro were dealing with lateral violences. And so I was very deep in some abolitionist readings and work. And however, as I continued my research journey, I found that there didn't seem to be substantial research on the topic, specifically to the Chamorro community. Within my project, I expected to find examples, right, of punishment, carcerality, harm, how it's felt and dealt with, but I also spent a lot of time framing things and listening for answers that focused on world building and collective creation. This project was about storying a collection of experiments that queer Chamorro are conducting every day. Second of my methods is land as pedagogy. Well, my creation story, the creation story of Wahan, based on this middle photo of Lasso Fuha or Fuha Rock, typically features a brother and sister. In my thesis, I retell this story with the brother and sister instead just simply being siblings. I do this because my ancestors had formed a generally tolerant society that did not emphasize gender in its construction until colonial impact, which can be seen in the investigation of gender neutrality in our language. And this story, suppressed and replaced by Catholicism, still inhibits limitations despite its revival stemming from resistance. If we did away with the binary and truly learned from our land, we could have children who grow up knowing all the qualities that the story of Punta and Putna teach us, and also have a community full of individuals who are unafraid of transcending their presumed or assigned forms. And I'm very curious about what could happen if we began to tell the story about Punta and Putna as if they were just siblings. And what if we accept they were trans? And maybe not trans in a way that is focused on gender, but trans in a way that is focused on transcending their current form because how they were born no longer served them. Trans in a way that recognizes that we come from the land, meaning that we are of it, and thus we return to it. We could have a community that understands their power and agency and utilize love and grief to create life. Lastly, we can have it so that all children can find themselves within their ancestors, queer or not. This one's a longer one. This is my first chapter, Carceral Forces. In this chapter, I document some of what can be found in previous research that relates to the control of sexuality and gender, as well as more general practices of care. The carceral forces identified by myself and my contributors are Catholicism in the US military. I speak about the first sodomy law put out during the naval era, a time in which the entire island of Guam was a military base. I make connections with feminization language used to justify the naval era and continued colonization of Guam by the US, and the 2025 executive order put out by the Trump administration against trans women. These ideas are connected to homo nationalism by Jasper Puar and homo militarism by Keith Camacho. Analyzing Guam as a strategic military outpost is important because after 9/11, the shift towards acceptance of gay people was utilized as a way to justify US actions, no matter how devastating, because it was in the name of national safety and security. Camacho describes a new era in which Guam is outed as a US territory in favor of homo militarism. Outing someone an act of non-consensual disclosure of one's sexual or gender identity and expression is being enacted by the US, at which they have intentionally shifted discourses to homonormativity to appeal to queer bodies in hopes of furthering the empire. However, queer and transgender also are given the opportunity to come out on our own accord and in a way that cultivates an erotics without empire and is vehemently opposed to the militarization of our islands and other peoples, honoring our indigenous recognition with each other and our land. The latter half of this chapter covers some of the consequences of these respective systems, such as my contributors experiencing or witnessing isolation and alienation of themselves and older relatives as a result of being queer. And I think one of the most concerning cases was a case in which someone had experienced doxing and censorship for sharing queer stories in Guam. Finally, of the effects documented, I described this connection of decolonization and queerness, at which queer tomorrows have noted decolonization spaces lacking and or inhibiting homophobic and transphobic tendencies, or in general, just an apathy towards queerness. And these are some photos from the zine. In my second chapter, Expansive Guinaiya and Inagofli'i as Practice, I give my contributors the space to remember their earliest memories of love, with answers often depicting expansiveness and diversities of care within their families and an expected focus on mothers and maternal figures. I employ these memories and definitions to see how they inform or contrast with the second half, which emphasizes practices. In this section, I demonstrate how practicing expansive Guinaiya requires practices we have always done, with a truly liberatory desire to reroute our queer and trans Chamorro siblings who are often silenced and erased in these practices. I make connections to previous and other indigenous arguments for storytelling and how these stories can transform colonial realities and norms, and instead affirm our community members who choose to diverge. Additionally, I expand on research on Queerness, which is informal adoption, which I and other Chamorros describe as found family, as a method to reduce harm in the face of homophobia and transphobia. I demonstrate Queerness' possibilities to be a liberatory practice as it holds components of ancient practices that sustain our people. Finally, a section I really enjoy and cover is solidarity and protest, as further examples, all of which are integral to disrupting propagandized images of Chamorro people, queer or not. And then for the purpose of time, I won't be discussing my third chapter, but it is the chapter in which I largely discuss the zine and the artworks and stories it holds. But folks can just kind of look at it there. To conclude, the forced relocation of the Chamorro people to the south was done. So the reductionist period was earlier slide in one of my chapters, but it was basically the forced relocation of the Chamorro people to the south southern villages in order to establish settlement and increase control through creating communities centered around the church. The redesigning of the family unit was imposed by the hunting of children, as praised by Spanish sources, the building of schools near churches, and the children's forced attendance, in which, quote, new ways of eating, dressing, and healing, and new approaches to sexuality promoted by the schools were not only different, but often irreconcilable with previous habits, end quote. In the face of this, my ancestors that's quoted here also, launched attacks and strategies in the pursuit of reclaiming their children in the face of what was an attack to our ways of living and being. Guinaiya and other tomorrows committed to a truly liberatory desire will continue to do so. Thank you. Really intense slide, but if you want to scan it into the Z, you can. Thank you.
Give everyone a moment to have the phone out. Yep, absolutely. Good. Good morning, everyone. I am Rory Clawson. I'm a full-time coordinator for the Global Urban Studies PhD program at Rutgers University at Newark, and I'm also working on a PhD part-time. Sorry, I think they got the wrong bio. I'm working on a PhD in American Studies focused on queer networks of artistic influence. Today's presentation is a bit of a side quest, not my main dissertation topic. Oh, here we go. So this project stems from a seminar in environmental justice, but I'm in the process of rethinking this as so you'll see a lot of that in it, but you'll also see this sort of meditation on public history practice, what it means to go into communities and work with them, tell their stories. I'm indebted to the organizers today. Thank you for all of your help sorting out issues. To the Berg Room staff at New York Public Library and Rowena Kennedy Epstein, who confirmed some of my hunches here. Again, here's a bit of a roadmap. I'll start talking about the Book of the Dead, a 20-section poem about an environmental disaster in West Virginia in the 1930s. It was published in 1938. I'll talk about the roots of Rukeyser's politics with some of her student activism, particularly around the Scottsboro 09 trial. Then think through the production of the volume as a sort of documentarian ethnographic or ethnographic fieldwork, possibly oral history in West Virginia, and then think through the queer race class threads coming together as an approximation of radical public history as we know it today, and as a form of queer collaboration. I forgot to turn on my timer. But so Rukeyser was a bit of a Renaissance woman. She delved into philosophy, science, but in these earliest years, her politics, her radical politics, her socialism were pretty core to her poetry, which riled some of her fellow poets of the time, calling her immature and such. I'm going to start us off with one of the openings of one of these poems, the sections of the poem. It is growing worse every day. At night, I get up to catch my breath. If I remained flat on my back, I believe I would die. It gradually chokes off the air cells in the lungs. I am trying to say it the best that I can. That is what happens, isn't it? A choking off of the air cells. That's from The Disease, one of the sections of the poem. These lines from the Book of the Dead are based on the words of George Robinson, one of the African-American leaders of the of a mining crew that was stricken with silicosis. He testified about his condition in front of the U.S. Congressional Committee, a U.S. Congressional Committee. In the early 1930s, Robinson was one of thousands of miners who worked on the Hawks Nest tunnel construction project in West Virginia. Like the majority of his fellow miners working for Union Carbide,
Robinson would ultimately die of complications stemming from exposure to silica dust, which is why this episode in US history is known as the Hawks Nest disaster. In his medical testimony illustrating the impact of this exposure, later incorporated by Rukeyser into her poem, he describes how the most mundane act of going to bed at night becomes increasingly impossible because of a looming sense of suffocation. Robinson's testimony offers insight into the degradation of their life, his life, both in terms of his lived experience, but also on the cellular and cultural levels, which Rukeyser considers throughout the Book of the Dead. Without being provided respirators or other safety equipment by Union Carbide or its subcontractor, Robinson and his fellow miners breathed in silica dust, essentially microscopic bits of glass that slowly formed scar tissue in the miners' lungs until they could no longer breathe. Of the 3,000 workers involved in the project, somewhere between 750 and 2,000 died as a result of this exposure. And of the vast majority, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the workers were African Americans, mostly migrant workers from the southern south, from farther south. George Robinson was from Georgia. So what I'd like to talk about here is this project started in 1930, and there was a lot of cover-ups, a lot of suggestion that these folks drawing attention to the issue, including George Robinson, were seeking attention, trying to enrich themselves financially. This project was a New Deal project to bore a hole through this mountain, Valley Mountain, to reroute a river for a hydroelectric project. So it's very much tied to the capital scene, very much tied to modernization of the United States. Well, here's where I get to the public history aspect of the paper. In 1936, a couple of years after the hearing George Robinson participated in, Muriel Rukeyser and her romantic interest at the time, Nancy Nomberg, traveled to Golly Bridge, Veneta, these communities, to catalog the atrocities, really. And that resulted in the Book of the Dead. Initially, Rukeyser was planning to write poems to be accompanied by the photography of Nancy Nomberg, who was a documentary filmmaker. Some of her work deals with Nova Scotian fishermen in the 1930s, and also New York City cab drivers, right? I argue that this is a sort of queer solidarity collaboration, and that their politics really led them to pursue this project, to travel to this community and magnify everything that had happened to these people through what ultimately became a poetry, a 20-section poem. Nomberg's photos were lost to history until about 6-7 years ago, and I'll show you some of those. Again, the Book of the Dead consists of about 20 poems. The title poem suggests that the young are our strength, who strike against history as we know it. And one of these poems is based on an interview after the other interview in Congress with George Robinson. It's in the form of blues lyrics, and centers on the Black community of Veneta, which is where a lot of these miners ended up setting up their homes, segregated from the white communities in the area. The community is hauntingly covered by, in this poem, the community is hauntingly covered down to everyone's skin in white silica dust. And she also, Robinson also recounts tales or rumors, perhaps, of folks being buried in mass graves at night in this community, just to cover the excesses going on in the mines. Some of the key takeaways here, clearly we have slow and spectacular violence, drawing on Robinson, Rob Nixon. We also have here what I would argue is a hybrid approach that Rukeyser takes stemming from this romantic relationship. It's a product of queer artistic collaboration centering race, class, and artifacts of recent history to affect change. I think I don't have time for another passage, but it's worth mentioning that Rukeyser, prior to this, she was also in Spain covering the left in the Civil War, and also covering the, as I mentioned earlier, Scottsboro 9 trial, going down there with other white students to protest and to be witnesses in the courtroom. Here's the effects of silicosis. Those are scarring. The white you see on this, there are scars that are forming, and another passage from a poem I don't think we have time for. Again, here is an actual map from the archive of the region. It's a little this is a hand-drawn map of them traveling there, and I thought it was interesting because my main project is mapping, and it's a visualization of these communities. So one of the things that I argue here is that Naumburg had a bigger role here, despite my title, in this act of public history, in that she captured these images, these very haunting images of the empty landscape, the communities, desolation, George Robinson's kitchen. He died soon after his interview, and the actual dam as it dominates the landscape. So as I close, I want to bring in Denise Merigiolo's definition of public history here, radical public history. It has a few ingredients here in that it's future focused, and the policy implications of this project are I think satisfy that part of this definition. A commitment to advancing social justice by exposing the environmental injustice taking place in this community. To the Naumburg and Rukeyser seek to better seek to better the conditions of workers, particularly Black workers, under capitalism. And I think by going into these communities and interviewing them, by capturing what these photographs and whatever didn't survive the historical record, they made a specific decision to enrich the understanding and recenter some of the discourse on Black workers particularly. Those focus, the newsreels of the time focused almost entirely on white workers that were affected by this. And I think this is one aspect of correcting the historical record. Unfortunately, a lot of their notes don't survive to talk about these last parts, the being reflective practice or shared inquiry or any of that. It's clear that they had very political motives in mind, and not necessarily that they had that they worked closely and in tandem, going back and forth with the folks that they interviewed. I think in part technology, the fact that the network of the interstate had barely started at this time, really impeded some of the at the public, the completing public history as we know it today. And then as a sort of a coda, there are some beautiful finds in the archive just about their relationship with each other. A nasty breakup letter. But it was just beautiful to have this confirmed that that there was there was a queer aspect to the solidarity they had with these workers. And then lastly, here's the most compelling evidence I leave with you. Naumburg is, even though Rukeyser is who I name in the presentation, I think Naumburg is in some ways the architect of this. In that one letter shows that this project should be, after Naumburg abandoned it, a terrible indictment of capitalism, showing the tunnel itself is a splendid thing to look at, but a terrible thing to contemplate. So thank you. I hope we have some time for questions.
Yes, and we do have a few minutes for Q&A, so I don't know, Craig, we prefer how it's gonna come up here or just kind of shift around and we can see what we can get done in the next few minutes. Okay. Well, everyone's choose themselves. Do we have some questions from the audience? Or if the panelists have questions for each other as well? Yep.
I'm kind of curious, with so many of your methods, they're so, I don't want to say niche, but they're unique and thoughtful and so different from a lot of other academic scholarship I've seen, at least in my area. Have you had any sort of issues in validating your methods? And I see the laughing. I like, have you been accused of research or any of those sorts of things, and how have you dealt with that as academics and scholars?
To everybody.
Generally, yes, whoever has an offset.
I feel like we could jump in, or what comes to mind, at least for I'll be really brief. I think some of the, at least the tools that we kind of nodded to, and hopefully just provided some kind of resources that if they're intriguing methods, you can kind of do some more digging. But there is some kind of inroads to some degree across different social sciences that kind of help support from, if you take an interdisciplinary perspective, this kind of foundation of legitimacy. So there's enough traction of how they surface that I think you can at least lean on and kind of build from. But I know you have a important perspective here.
Yeah, well, no, I think there's something interesting about what happens when you just use a kind of a phrase queer and no one kind of radical kind of methodology. And then all hell breaks loose, right? Both within the academy itself and then also trying in the dissemination of this type of work. And I think persistence and solidarity. So I was really intrigued as I was hearing my colleagues think about the different kind of, call them methods and methodologies of probing or kind of working alongside within the tense and we're working with. And there were some really beautiful sort of phrases that I'm now thinking about in relation to my work as well. So maybe that's about kind of creating these types of spaces that are alongside some of the formal landscape institutions that we all are living within.
Yeah, there.
Maybe just to try to get you guys in there, I mean, you all mentioned like the sensory piece, right? And like the senses, I think, came up in interesting ways across all of your papers. maybe not like, you're not the embodied researcher in this case, you're talking about the listening and so on, but I just sort of, could you pick up that question of the sensory and how the sensory kind of informs your approach to your materials? Would that be good?
That's a really excellent question. I think that's not something that I had previously considered, but I also think not only about like the listening for sounds that don't exist, that the text ends with, but also like the sense of like the raw sting.
Yeah.
And I think your question is making me contemplate how these sensory experiences are one way in which we encounter one another. And maybe in reaching for sounds that don't exist, that might even be more profound than trying to empathize or think critically about building relations with one another.
Corey or Lauren, and you want to add?
I would say that this project really came out of the moment where where Black Lives Matter and pulse oximeters during COVID were shown to be less effective on Black skin. So I've been thinking about the different registers down to the somatic, the sensory, that really do connect us, do provide those wells, those bridges for solidarity. I think that's not only the way that we empathize, but it's the power of literature to share experience and to convey the seriousness of the detriment to bodies under capitalism.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but please find our panelists if you have more ways that you want to engage with them and their work. Thank you so much to everyone for being such a great audience.